For decades, archaeology agreed on one simple story. Humans reached the Americas around 13,000 years ago. But in the California desert, one of the world's most respected scientists believed the story was wrong by more than 100,000 years. However, while what he found was dismissed, the question never really went away. So was Calico rejected because it failed or because it arrived too early? Hi guys, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Michael. I have a degree in ancient history, and on this channel, we discuss the unexplainable mysteries of our past. Let's get into it. Until recently, archaeologists agreed that humans reached America only around 13,000 years ago. But one of the most respected scientists in the world claimed that number was wrong by over 100,000 years. This is Calico, in the California desert, where Louis Leakey, arguably the most influential paleoanthropologist in the world, was convinced he'd found human-made tools that were much older than they should have been. But his evidence was dismissed, the site was written off, and the entire field turned on him. So was Calico rejected because the evidence failed, or because archaeology wasn't ready for what it would rewrite? The problem with Calico is that back in the 1960s, the story of how humans reached America was pretty much locked in. In 1926, archaeologists found a stone point buried with an extinct bison skeleton in New Mexico. That proved humans were here during the Ice Age. Then, in the 1930s, they found larger points with mammoth bones in Colorado and New Mexico. These became known as Clovis points, and they appeared everywhere, all dated to roughly the same time. When radiocarbon dating arrived in 1949, it finally gave archaeology the tool it needed, and every Clovis site came back with the same result, roughly 13,000 years old. Alright, quick break. This video is sponsored by Fishing Clash. We're talking a lot about lost human history, fragments that survive almost by accident, and that's actually why I've been enjoying this game. Fishing Clash is all about exploring huge environments and tracking down rare things. You're fishing everywhere, from the Florida coast to the Amazon River, pulling in bass, trout, marlin, even sharks, some of which only show up occasionally, so every cast feels like it might be the one. I've been playing it a lot recently because it's genuinely relaxing, but also very competitive. You can upgrade your gear, unlock new locations, jump into duels, all without it feeling stressful. If you're a new player, download the game using my link in the description, or scan the QR code on screen, then head into settings and enter my gift code, Michael Button, all one word. I'll show you exactly where to put it right here on the screen. If you do that, you'll get a $20 value starter reward completely free, which is a solid boost at the start. So thanks so much to Fishing Clash for sponsoring. Now let's get back to the video. It seemed like that explained everything, and as we've covered before, going against that idea could be pretty horrific for your career. Peer reviewers, especially influential figures like geoarchaeologist Vance Haynes, subjected any pre-Clovis claim to insane levels of scrutiny, and it wasn't all bad faith. European archaeology had already embarrassed itself with something called eoliths. These were naturally broken flints that researchers once claimed were primitive human tools. It's just, well, later they turned out to be geological accidents. That mistake stung quite a bit, so by the 1960s, American archaeologists were determined not to repeat it. However, the result was overcorrection and extreme skepticism about any claim that didn't come with bulletproof context. But then, in 1959, everything shifted. Ruth DeEtte Simpson, a Californian archaeologist, showed some stone fragments from the Calico Hills to Louis Leakey. And if you don't know the name Louis Leakey, you should. He was one of the most famous paleoanthropologists in the world. He discovered some of humanity's oldest ancestors in Africa at sites like Olduvai Gorge. When Leakey said something mattered, people listened. And when he saw those stones from Calico, he became convinced that they were tools, not 15,000 years ago, but over 100,000 years old. But his reasoning was based on something odd: language. You see, Leakey had noticed something strange about Native American languages. The Americas held nearly half of the world's distinct language families, despite being a fraction of Earth's landmass. That kind of linguistic diversity takes time to develop, a lot of time. In fact, Leakey estimated it would take 35,000 to 100,000 years for that many languages to evolve, not the 12,000 years the Clovis first idea allowed.
Now, this argument didn't prove that Calico was real, but it did create pressure on the timeline.
And crucially, Leakey had been right before. In Africa, he'd pushed back the age of human evolution again and again, against skeptical colleagues who thought he was wrong. So when National Geographic funded excavations at Calico in 1963, the question became unavoidable. Was Leakey seeing the same kind of pattern he'd seen in Africa, or this time, was he projecting it onto noise? Well, over the next decade, the team excavated roughly 70,000 fractured stone specimens from the site, and the material itself was pretty telling. Every piece came from high-quality stone suitable for toolmaking: chalcedony, chert, jasper, quartz, exactly what you'd want if you were making tools. But dating the site wasn't straightforward. A buried rock ring gave two results. Thermoluminescence dated the deposits to 135,000 years old. Uranium series analysis came back at roughly 200,000 years. And separately, researchers dated a surface boulder using beryllium-10. That gave a minimum age for the deposits of 197,000 years, give or take 20,000. Then there was the pattern. When researchers analysed over 3,500 flakes and blades, 26% showed clear bulbs of percussion, the kind of impact marks you get when stone is struck deliberately. 70% had no cortex, the outer rind of the stone, which suggested they'd been worked down through multiple stages. Nearly half showed multiple facets on the upper surface, evidence that flakes had been removed systematically from a core. Now that's exactly how experienced toolmakers produce flakes. At least one refitted core was found during excavation, a piece with flakes that fit back together perfectly. The trouble is, when the volunteer who found it showed it to the site director, she said bag it and send it to the lab. No photographs, no formal documentation.
So refits were found, but they weren't documented the way they should have been. For critics, this is a pretty big problem because without proper documentation, it's much harder to verify anything.
What is really striking though is just how much was found grouped in one place. One excavation unit alone produced over 1,000 fragments. These clusters were dense and made from multiple source rocks, the kind of pattern you'd expect from something like a workshop. But when they dug control pits nearby, they found almost nothing, a few dozen pieces at most. If natural processes were breaking rocks across the entire area, you'd expect similar densities everywhere. But the master pits had hundreds of times more material than the nearby surrounding zones. On top of that, most of the specimens were still sharp. Around 80% kept good edges, and some were sharp enough to cut skin during excavation. So if these stones had tumbled from miles through mud flows and gravel, you'd expect them to be rounded and worn.
This means that if this was natural fracture, then it was behaving in a way that natural fracture usually doesn't. Thus, Leakey proposed that these were tools from staggeringly long ago. However, as you can imagine, not everyone was convinced.
In 1970, an international conference of archaeologists got together at Calico to settle the debate. Leakey presented his evidence. The experts examined the specimens, reviewed the stratigraphy, and the meeting ended in stalemate. A lot of people walked away unconvinced. Some said bluntly that the stones looked like those pesky geofacts. Others were more intrigued. But overall, Leakey didn't get the validation he needed. Then, 3 years later, geologist Vance Haynes, the Clovis defender we mentioned earlier, visited the site himself and published a paper in Science that became the definitive counter-argument. Haynes identified multiple geological processes that could produce tool-like fractures without any human involvement. Things like tectonic stress from earthquakes, weathering and freeze-thaw cycles, rocks tumbling against each other during stream transport, pressure from overlying sediment squeezed buried stones, and repeated cycles of erosion and redeposition. Haynes did actually make a really important point. The pressure of a tough, rounded rock pressed against the edge of chert can create a flaked edge that's indistinguishable from one made deliberately by human hands. And then, in 1982, archaeologist Sam Pyon applied the Barnes test, a statistical method that measures flake scar angles. Human toolmakers tend to produce acute angles. Random natural fractures produce more obtuse angles. Pyon's analysis of Calico found no significant difference between the specimens and naturally fractured stones.
But there's a problem with the Barnes test. It assumes stones were struck directly with a hammer, but later research showed that bipolar flaking, an ancient technique when you rest a stone on an anvil and strike from above, produces 90-degree angles. So the test would read those as natural when they are not.
However, a separate study by researchers Duval and Venner went further. They measured 7 attributes of each specimen: length, width, thickness, and different edge angles. Then they compared them to authenticated ancient tools, and it turns out the Calico materials didn't cluster with human-made tools. They clustered with naturally fractured cobbles. And perhaps most importantly, Calico was such a ridiculous outlier. Every other site in the Americas pointed to a date of roughly 13,000 years ago, or younger. For Leakey to be saying that this site was possibly over 100,000 years was so out there, so outrageous, that it simply didn't fit.
So scientists concluded the Calico specimens were form-selected examples of naturally flaked rock, not intentional tools. And for Leakey, the cost was devastating.
His wife, Mary Leakey, herself a renowned archaeologist, later wrote that his involvement with Calico was catastrophic to his career. She said it was one of the main reasons for the breakdown of their marriage. She even went on to say that the work made her lose academic respect for him. By 1968, the couple had begun leading separate professional lives. They stopped collaborating. Their partnership, built on decades of groundbreaking discoveries in Africa, fell apart. Leakey continued as project director at Calico until his death in 1972, but he never convinced the scientific community. Everyone was convinced that the stones were geofacts and that the site wasn't evidence of early human occupation. Textbooks used it as an example of how even brilliant scientists can be wrong, how prestige doesn't guarantee correctness, and how confirmation bias can lead you to see patterns that aren't there.
But then, new discoveries started changing everything.
In 1977, at a site called Monteverde in southern Chile, archaeologists found wooden structures preserved in peat, stone tools in clear association with hearths, and butchered megafauna remains. When skeptics visited the site, they reached unanimous consensus. Pre-Clovis occupation was real. Monteverde broke the Clovis first paradigm overnight. Then the floodgates opened. White sands in New Mexico revealed human footprints dated between 21 and 23,000 years old. Bluefish Caves, the site that destroyed Jacques St. Mars's career in the 1970s, got re-examined. Researcher Lurian Borzon analyzed 36,000 bone fragments using modern cut mark identification criteria, and she found 18 mammoth bones with marks that all met 6 modern standards for human butchery, and this was from 24,000 years ago.
We now have no real idea when humans first reached the Americas, but we do know it was far earlier than Clovis. And on top of this, much older, far more controversial sites are starting to make Calico look much less like an outlier.
Take the Cerruti Mastodon site in California, where fractured mastodon bones and stone tools point to human activity around 130,000 years ago, published in Nature. If true, that date alone rewrites everything. Or Huetzlaco in central Mexico, where stone tools were found alongside volcanic ash layers dated to hundreds of thousands of years old. So old, in fact, the site was effectively sidelined because the dates were deemed impossible, not because the artifacts weren't real. And then there's nearby Jalnene Tuf, a volcanic deposit containing what appears to be human and animal footprints, again dated to staggeringly long ago, somewhere between the admittedly huge range of 40,000 years ago to 1.3 million years ago, depending on the method used. It's important to note though that many dispute this.
Individually, each of these sites is labelled as controversial, and in some cases with good reason. But together they form a pattern, and once you have this pattern, Calico starts to look less like an anomaly, and starts looking like an early warning that we may have ignored.
So where does that leave Calico? At the moment, even with modern methods, we haven't found any human remains. There are no butchered animal bones. There's no charcoal from hearths, ceramics, or ornamental objects. Accepted pre-Clovis sites all have at least some of this corroborating evidence, and the sheer number of specimens here cuts both ways. To skeptics, it looks like geology. Dig through enough old gravel and you'll find thousands of rock fragments that resemble tools. To believers, those densities and the lack of similar fragments nearby look just like a human workshop. Since the 1980s, archaeologists have also got better at telling geofacts from real tools. They measure edge angles, look at platform characteristics, analyze scar patterns on the stone surface, and compare everything to experimental collections made under controlled conditions. The trouble is, when those methods do get applied to Calico, most specialists still see fractured gravel, not a recognizable stone industry.
So the evidence against Calico is strong, but Leakey's intuition about pre-Clovis was 100% correct. Humans did reach the Americas far earlier than Clovis first allowed, and we have no idea how far back.
And later work at Calico did find at least one unambiguous tool, the rock wren biface, a large, shaped implement from a younger deposit, dated to around 14,000 years ago. That confirms people were using this area by late Ice Age times. Today, Calico is still being excavated, mostly by volunteers working under the Bureau of Land Management. A small group of researchers still argues that the deep pits contain genuine tools, and that critics dismiss the site way too quickly, but the mainstream view hasn't shifted. Without bones, hearths, or unambiguous tools in a secure context, Calico can't meet the standard. So was Calico rejected because it was wrong, or because it asked a question archaeology couldn't answer yet? The truth is, probably both. But Leakey's intuition about pre-Clovis was right. Humans did reach America far earlier than the field believed, and Calico, flawed as it was, applied pressure to a paradigm that needed breaking. It forced archaeology to confront the possibility that the timeline was wrong, even if the site itself couldn't prove it.
Thanks so much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like, a comment, or subscribing to my channel down below. I'll see you next time.